I'd like to begin today by expressing my sincere thanks to Westminster College and to the Utah Council for Citizen Diplomacy. In supporting this lecture series, these institutions are sustaining an important ongoing discussion about the role we all must play in building a more peaceful world, and that could not possibly be more important right now. When our democratically elected leaders fail to act like leaders, in a time when we've simply come to expect petulance and tantrums and spitefulness from the top, and when our representatives fail to represent the best of who we are and the most decent of who we aspire to be, we the people have to redouble our efforts to be shining examples of humanity and compassion and good humor and love for all of our brothers and sisters across this tiny planet. That's what this lecture series is about. And I thank Westminster and I thank the Council and all of the sponsors and donors for providing this ongoing forum. Next, a specific thanks for this amazingly kind invitation. I'm very honored to have been invited to be a part of this series. I'm hopeful that I'll be able to add something of merit to this ongoing dialogue. I'm here today to speak about international journalism, correspondency, and the role that we all can play in preserving this form of storytelling. Before we jump into that, though, I'd like to ask you as a matter of courtesy, if you could take out your phones and turn them on. I know that some people feel like it's rude to have a phone out during a lecture, but I'd like to change that paradigm. I'd like to turn it on its head. From the time that we started carrying phones around in our pockets, we've been obsessed with making sure they're out of sight and out of mind during events like this. The reason we do this, I suppose, is because we don't want speakers' feelings to be hurt should they suddenly realize that they're less interesting to their audience than their phones are. But there's a couple of reasons why that's not going to happen today. First of all, these lights are bright. I can't see you anyway. Second of all, if I'm doing my job, and I do intend to do my job, I'm going to be earning your attention. And if I'm not doing my job, then by all means, you should feel perfectly free to be doing something else. I recommend words with friends. I find that to be... This is not working. It is. Oh, my slides aren't working. This is so sad. You guys are going to have to look at Ernest Hemingway the entire time. I mean, he's a good-looking guy. He was a good-looking guy. He got uglier later in life, but... Is that something, Felicia, that we can work on? Okay, thanks. Instead of being offended if you have your phones out, I'm honestly going to be a little bit offended if I don't see a little glow out there. Because if I'm doing my job, and again, I do intend to do my job, I'm going to be sharing with you some ideas that are worth sharing with other people. And we live in an absolutely magical world. We live in an era in which we have the power at any time and from virtually any place, including this place right here, to tell the world what we are learning. And extracurricular learning, such as this is really a privilege. It truly is a privilege. You and I only wind up in a place like this doing something like what we're doing today because we're in a position of some considerable dispensation from a historic condition of life. We don't have to be working right now. We're not too sick to be here today. We're not outside battling the cold. We're in a beautiful, heated building surrounded by very nice people who are at this moment, taking out a pocket-sized instrument of plastic, glass, and metal that is a portal to the rest of the world. That is some crazy privilege. And to the extent that it is possible to do so, I believe that we have the responsibility to share our privilege with others. And since we live in the future, we can do that. So please do. I really would love it if you would take out your phones, your laptops, your tablets, whatever else, fire up Twitter, and while you're there, I'm going to do a little shameless self-promotion here. You can follow me at @MDLaPlante, or you can fire up Facebook, or you can fire up Instagram, or you can just open up your email app and consider writing a note to someone. Write a note to your best friend, or to your mom, or to your brother about what we're talking about today. Share something. You can comment, you can criticize, for God's sake, criticize people. Cry foul, you can start a conversation. You can do it in a place where everyone can see you doing it. Let's see here. And if you do that, then you're not just paying forward a bit of your privilege. You are actually committing an act of journalism. A lot of people don't consider themselves journalists, and a lot of people, if you told them, hey, you're a journalist, well, those would be fighting words, right? But I'd wager that just about everyone here is, in fact, already a journalist. That's because there are just two rules for doing journalism. The first rule is that you're engaging in an act of nonfiction. Whether you're attempting to be objective or you're offering an admittedly subjective view on an issue, you're not making anything up. You may have opinions, everybody may have opinions, but when in support of those opinions, you offer up a piece of information as a fact, then it is, in fact, to the best of your human ability to ascertain truth. True. The second rule is that you're engaging in that act of nonfiction for an audience that is bigger than yourself. Journalism isn't journaling. You need an audience to do that. So these are the rules. These are the only two rules for journalism. I teach this stuff. This is like I've figured it out. I've whittled it down to two rules. I can tell them to my students the first day class, they never have to come back. Rule number one, facts that are factual. Rule number two, you're doing it for an audience. And if you've ever conveyed truthful information to an audience through the use of some media, like say Facebook or Twitter, let's say on your personal blog or on the comment section of a news organization's website, well, my friends, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but you are in fact a journalist. You have committed specific acts of journalism, and you have participated in larger acts of journalism. Okay, now we're going to take a moment and we're all going to turn to our neighbors and we're going to console them. Give them a little pat on the shoulder, tell them it's going to be okay. I know it's a little like when you found out you were a feminist for the first time, right? It's okay, you got over it then. You're a better person for it. You're going to get over this now. So here we are. We're a room full of journalists. Someone in here right now is practicing their journalism live. Oh, Christ, you guys are practicing your journalism live. Why do I always tell people to do this? So where do we go from here? To answer that question, and even though I can't see you really well unless I do, oh yeah, I can see you now. All right, let me take a little survey. By a show of hands, wait, no, that's not active. I like to be a little aggressive. By an affirmative shout of like, I do, or hell yeah, or you betcha, how many people here have a passport? Dang, that's damn near everybody. That's really great, because as you probably already know, Americans, most of them don't have passports. Just over a third of U.S. citizens have a passport. That's compared to almost 2/3 of Canadians and 3/4 of Brits and Aussies. And it's not just those who can't afford to travel who don't have the proper documentation to do so. Because that's perfectly reasonable. The truth is that many of those who absolutely could afford to travel simply don't wish to engage in the world in that way. And thus they often don't even have a passport. And these folks really piss off Rick Steves. Steves might be one of the world's most famous wanderlusters, and he's rather famously said that in a world in which so many governments and political leaders are actively conspiring to make us afraid of one another, the most radical and patriotic thing you can do is to travel. And I agree with that almost entirely. There is for me just like one kind of caveat, and it also has to do with privilege, because travel is a privilege. It's something you generally can't do unless you have some degree of expendable income. It's also something that comes at a cost to our planet in the form of carbon emissions. And even though it's not a very popular thing to say in a room full of people who like to travel, I'm going to say it anyway. One of the most ecologically destructive things you can do today is to get on an airplane. And so if that's something you regularly do, please consider purchasing fossil fuel offset credits. I've committed to doing that for all of my personal and business travel. It's not very expensive and it makes you feel good about yourself. I would also like you to consider that responsible privilege is privilege that is always paid forward. We actually learned about this from a very young age. I learned it from the Yosefa family, who were the only folks in the neighborhood where I grew up in California who had a swimming pool. And they opened their backyard on hot summer days to all of the kids in the hood. We're in Utah, so maybe the better analogy is trampolines. If you've got a trampoline and you don't let the other kids play on it, up, right? Now, another show of hands. No, that's not active enough. Instead, let's do this. By a show of standing up. If you plan to go to Central or South America anytime in the next year, could you stand up for me? Awesome. Bravo. Whoa. Bravo, amigos. Okay, all right. You guys can sit down. If you are headed to Europe in the next year, could you stand up? I just want to lecture to this group all the time. I love you people already. How about Asia? Fantastic. Okay, thank you. A lot of you are getting that multiple times. Africa? Outstanding. Australia? Oh, we lost it. Yes! Thank you. All right, you saved us. The next one's tough, though, right? The next one's really tough. This is going to Antarctica. Really? Are you really? Oh my God! Okay, can we see each other afterward? I want to be your new bestie, okay? I want to go with you. I don't have a big bucket list. I only have I have one thing in my pocket. It's Antarctica. Let's not forget that we share this continent with 22 other countries and self-governing territories. If you're going to one of those places in North America next year, will you stand up? Wow. Okay, folks, we travel a lot. Now, don't worry. I don't expect you to buy plane tickets for all of the neighborhood kids. Okay? Travel isn't a trampoline. But you have the power to pay forward some of your privilege when you travel by doing the same thing that some of you are doing right now on Twitter or Facebook or the blog that you keep that only grandma reads. You can commit acts of journalism. And today, I'm not only going to make the argument that you can, but that you really should, because it's really, really important right now. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not talking about posting photos of yourself on the beach with margarita. That does, I suppose, mean the very broad definition of journalism I spelled out earlier. It's factual. It's intended for an audience. But just like I can throw some paint on a canvas and I can call it art, I can put a photo on Facebook and I can call it journalism. That doesn't necessarily make for good art, and it doesn't necessarily make for good journalism. At the same time, I don't want you to be intimidated by the words good journalism. I know that sounds hard, and if there are any journalists in the room, they're going to tell you that it's really hard, but you know what? It's simply not true. It's really not. If journalism was hard, I couldn't do it. I'm not that smart. All I mean when I say good journalism is that instead of having our cameras on selfie mode all the time, we just turn them around. And instead of telling people about the experiences that we're having, we seek to share the experiences of other people with whom we share this world. Another way to think about this is to embrace the common internet abbreviation TIL for Today I Learned. Folks use this to precede a fact that they've recently come upon, usually something surprising or clever or inspiring or sometimes even lamentable that's helped shape the way they see the world on that day. And often we TIL about stuff that we learned while we were surfing the internet. And there's nothing wrong with that, particularly if we engage in just a little bit of responsible fact-checking first. But I would suggest that a better use of TIL is to share things that we learn about the people with whom we share this world while we are traveling. And today I'm going to offer an example of how to do this. Last week I was in Ethiopia. I actually wasn't there to commit acts of journalism per se. I was there doing some research for a book that I'm writing about what scientists are learning from studying organisms that have evolved to have superlative characteristics. So I was down in the southern nationalities and peoples region tracking elephants. Those are, of course, the largest land mammals to live on our planet in 65 million years. And I was in the Oromia region to visit a sanctuary for cheetahs, which are, of course, the fastest land animals on our planet in terms of absolute speed. Relative speed, by the way, totally different story. I got to digress here for just a minute. There's this little mite in Southern California. Everybody knows it. It's been known to everyone for like 100 years, but nobody studied it, and nobody ever timed the thing. Relative to its body size, it runs the equivalent of 1,300 miles per hour. Cheetahs. I could have been there on vacation, or I could have been there for business. Either way, when one visits Ethiopia, when one is even a little bit curious about the world, one notices things. And that is true, of course, of any place we go. Travel offers a remarkable opportunity for us to see nuance, little points of inflection that help bring context to our own lives and the world around us. And on this trip, the context came by way of a man who I first met during my first trip to Ethiopia in 2011. We hadn't seen each other for 3 or 4 years at that point, so of course I asked him how he was doing, and he told me that he had been suffering from a great deal of depression since we last saw each other. And that sparked in me a moment of curiosity. I thought, wow, what is it like to battle mental health issues in a developing nation like Ethiopia? If there's been reporting on that subject, I haven't seen it. My friend told me as we were talking about this, that it was really hard to find anybody in the country who had any experience whatsoever treating depression. But as hard as it was at first to get help, it's gotten even harder lately because there are so many more people who are now seeking care at the few clinics that do mental health in Addis Ababa. So based on that conversation, I formulated something of a TIL. And my TIL was this. Today I learned that waiting rooms in the few mental health clinics in Ethiopia are getting busier. That's how it starts. Now, I want to make it clear here. It's not like I heard this and formulated this question and suddenly I dropped everything that I was supposed to be doing to pursue it. If I had been on vacation, I still could have been on vacation. I didn't have to stop doing that. And if I had only been I was working a lot while I was there, but I didn't have to stop working. I still had to go south to chase the elephant, and then I had to go north again to find cheetahs. I still did all of that. What I also did, though, was I just started asking questions and taking notes. Just collecting facts, just trying to learn something. And it wasn't like I was walking up to people on the street being like, hey, can you tell me about your mental health problem? But what I did is as I got to know people during my trip, I mentioned this thing that I was also interested in, this observation that I had made. And you know what? Everybody had something to offer me. Some experience, some perspective, some fact that I hadn't known before. And all of that eventually led me to a psychiatrist's office in Addis Ababa, which led me to another clinic on the other side of town, and those visits led me to several people who were willing to speak openly about the struggles that they were facing. And pretty soon I had a better and clearer picture of this thing that I had been curious about. And so now here's the part that makes this journalism, right? Journalism is two things. It's factual and it's shared with the public audience. I'm going to share what I learned with an audience. Now I can do that in a few different ways. I'm fortunate to have connections to a network of editors and journalists across the country. So I've pitched this story to a newspaper with which I've done business before, and they've agreed to purchase it from me. But the fact that I'm going to make a few dollars for this piece doesn't make it journalism any more than if I published it on my personal blog. And publishing it there as just essentially a work of narrative nonfiction wouldn't make it any more an act of journalism than if I published it as a Twitter thread, or if I published it as a graphic novel, or if I published it as a short video documentary, or as a podcast, or heck, I don't know, like a series of knock-knock jokes. The medium we use to tell stories has nothing to do with whether or not something is journalism. Again, the only real rules for calling something journalism are that whether it is intended to be objective or opinionated, what we purport to be facts are actually facts, and that it's intended for a public audience. And hey, you know what? This is a public audience. So if it's okay with you, what I'd like to do is I'd like to complete the process here by telling you what I learned before it's published anywhere else. Is that all right? Cool? All right. And this story is long, so I'm going to read you the lead. That's the top part of the story. And then I'm going to tell you about some of the key takeaways. Am I still doing my job? This is the part where I start to wonder about my cell phone policy. We're good? Okay. If you take a drink before you read something, it makes it seem like what you're doing is more serious. The former army snapper was falling apart, and to his closest friends, those with whom he'd served in the war in Somalia, that struggle was abundantly clear. What wasn't so certain was how best to help him, because even as his comrades begged him to seek mental health care, they recognized that good psychiatric help, any psychiatric help for that matter, was going to be hard to find. It wasn't always that way. When one of the soldiers' military friends, Webashet Abawa, first sought help for his own depression 3 years ago, he was admitted without delay to an inpatient treatment program at the Satota Center for Mental Health Care. At that time, if you knew that you needed help, and you knew about the center, and you had the money to pay for treatment, it was easy to get help, Abawa said. During Abawa's follow-up visits, the wait was only minutes. But by the time Abawa's army friend needed help, all of that had changed. And soon the soldier was dead of his own hand. He was 29. Abawa returned to Satota for an emergency visit with his psychiatrist the next day. And when he arrived, the waiting room was packed. There, in several long rows of padded chairs facing the bustling reception desk, was a young boy in a Manchester United jersey and an old woman whose face was tattooed with an Orthodox cross. There was a businessman in a finely tailored suit and a policewoman in uniform. There were Ethiopians of every race and religion, but not of every economic class. Globalization and economic improvements have brought a lot of change to Ethiopia, the fastest growing economy in Africa. The rapid development has pulled millions out of abject poverty, prompted a mass migration into the nation's urban center, stoked a growing middle class, and put the tools of the information age in the hands of an increasingly tech-savvy population. But those changes have come with a side effect that few expected: a skyrocketing demand for psychiatric services that has left mental health providers feeling helpless to keep up. So that's the setup, that's the TIL. Globalization affects the way people seek care for mental health, but there aren't enough places to get care. The rest of the piece is what I gathered when I simply asked as many humans as I could find who had been impacted by this problem a very simple question. I asked them the question, why? And there are millions of reasons for everything, but here are the things that I heard again and again. First, greater access to information has helped Ethiopians realize the challenges they've been struggling with for a lifetime, problems that in many cases they've been told by their religious leaders to handle with more prayer, might in fact be treatable if only they could access the care. Second, urbanization has disconnected people from traditional support structures like community parenting and having multiple generations of people living under one roof, and that's caused a lot of people to feel more stressed and more anxious and more alone. Third, as a result of those disconnections, substance abuse is on the rise. Fourth, globalization has given Ethiopians a view of Western-style psychiatric help that is both not economically realistic and not necessarily culturally appropriate, and the inability to access the sort of care that they see on TV may in some cases actually be aggravating some people's challenges. Now, are those the only answers to the question of why? No, I very much doubt it. And I'm not telling you anything that any Ethiopian who's considered this question for very long themselves didn't figure out a very long time ago. I'm not here to propose solutions or to pretend that a few days of exploration of a very complicated issue gives me any special insight that will help the people who actually have to face these challenges. What I am hoping to do is to connect some of my brothers and sisters here in the United States to the challenges being faced by some of my brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. And so maybe there's a student who will encounter this work who's going into development work. And maybe this puts in their mind that rising economic tides can sometimes produce turbulent psychological seas. And maybe they'll work toward ensuring that that's a consideration in development initiatives in other parts of the world. Or maybe there's a psychiatrist who's going to read this who's been thinking for a while about paying their privileges forward. And maybe they'll make contact with a colleague in Ethiopia or another developing nation to ask if there's anything that they can do to help. Or maybe none of that stuff happens. Maybe I simply just shared a story that makes my brothers and sisters in Ethiopia a little more relatable to my brothers and sisters here. Those people, Americans, Westerners in general, their impressions of Ethiopia are usually no deeper than what they learned on infomercials featuring Sally Struthers and the Christian Children's Fund back in the 1980s. But for me, that's good enough. That's enough to feel good about sharing stories. Because you know what? We live in a world full of people who are doing their absolute damnedest to make us afraid of one another. And I'm sorry to say they are really good at this. And everything we can do to remind each other of our mutual humanity and our common decency and our shared dreams is a strike against hate and destructive nationalism and downright fascism. This guy, for whatever else you might have decided about him, has figured out how to use social media as a tool for telling stories. And the stories that he tells, right or wrong, are divisive, and they're angry, and they're full of boogeymen. All right, so get right or wrong. What's wrong? They're all about how we should be afraid. They're all about how everything in this world is somebody else's fault. If you want to fight fascism, you can do it by telling stories that are true, stories that honor the privilege we have to travel and to see and to learn by sharing that privilege with others. And the other reason this is important is because it's just not getting done by the folks who once purported to do it. I mean, it's something of an indicator of how bad things are when things stop getting measured altogether, and that appears to be the case when it comes to foreign correspondence. The most recent reliable report I could find on the question of how many American journalists were reporting overseas came from the American Journalism Review in 2011, 6 years ago. But in the 8 years preceding that census, the number of American foreign correspondents working for newspapers fell from 307 to 234. And I've got to tell you, I was actually pretty shocked that we still had 234 newspaper correspondents in overseas bureaus in 2011. But I'd be even more shocked if we had anything close to that number today. 20 newspapers completely ended the practice of keeping staff overseas as of 2011. At that time, that left just 10 papers that were still maintaining a bureau in even one foreign country. And bureau is sometimes a misleading term. As of June of this year, for instance, the Washington Post had 16 bureaus, but 9 of them were staffed by just one person, and all but one of them had just 2 people. The Post, which I'll go ahead and go on record as saying is my favorite news organization, currently just has 2 reporters on the entire continent of Africa, and only 1 in the southern hemisphere of our globe. This map, which is on the Post website right now, is misleading because it shows a bureau in Brazil, but the guy who was working for the paper there filed the last story for the Post in January, and he hasn't been replaced. What that means is that the incredibly cannibalistic American media ecosphere is relying more on wire services like the Associated Press and Reuters, which still have relatively robust presences overseas, but produce the same news stories for every one of their clients. Meaning, what you read in San Francisco Chronicle is going to be the same thing that you read in the Miami Herald. The situation in television isn't much better. Bureaus staffed by cable news channels dropped from 53 to 48 between 2010 and 2015. That doesn't sound like such a big drop, but if you consider the number of people working those bureaus, it's terrifying. CNN accounts for most of those bureaus, actually, but it's laid off staff dedicated to international issues in recent years, hundreds and hundreds of people. In short, it is doing about the same amount of work with less. The situation overseas, I'm sorry to say, isn't a lot better. I'm a big fan of the BBC, but it has suffered major cuts, financial cuts to the world service in the past few years. Al Jazeera laid off 500 employees last year because the price of oil fell. But hey, here's the good news. Russia Today and China Central Television are growing. So if you like news that is directly paid for by those particular governments, then you're in luck. Back on our soil last year, the three main American news networks, their programs dedicated an average of 1 minute and 14 seconds to foreign news each night. ABC, by the way, calls its nightly news program World News Tonight, but of the three major networks, it dedicated the least number of minutes to stories before in Dateline. But regardless of the network, the international stories that were covered were pretty much the same. If it wasn't Zika, or the Syrian Civil War, or the Rio Olympic Games, or Hurricane Matthew, the Brussels terrorism bombing, Russian cyber espionage, or the Battle of Mosul and Iraq, it didn't get much, if any, airplay. And what do all of these things have in common? Well, with the exception of the games in Rio, which received generally but not exclusively positive media coverage, all of those stories are about disasters and man's inhumanity to man. And that's because the Global Reporting Corps is concentrated in a few cities around the world and really only sweeps into other places when bad things are happening. And folks, let me tell you, that plays into the hands of people who want to convince us that the world is a big, scary, terrible place. A big, scary, terrible place that only they can protect us from, so long as we consent to give them the power to do so, and that power generally comes at the cost of our civil rights and to other people's lives. And the result of all of this is an information void, a void of stories that aren't about wars and natural disasters and diseases. There is a void of stories that simply make an observation about a place and people in that place and then ask why, and then offer a few potential answers. There's a void of stories that connect us to one another with emotions that aren't fear and contempt. Now, please don't get me wrong, even in the best of times, even in the golden age of foreign correspondency, if there ever was such a thing, we really didn't ever do global reporting all that well. Chiefly because the people who were gathering stories and sending them back to us they looked a lot like me, except for maybe without the tattoos and probably more hair. But in a whole lot of other ways, they looked like me. Ernest Hemingway for the Toronto Star in Paris and Spain and Cuba, Edward Murrow for CBS across Europe during World War II, Ted Koppel in China and the Middle East with Nixon and Kissinger. Our foreign correspondents traditionally have been mostly white men of moderate to considerable means, who've been educated in a certain way to tell stories in a certain way, and always with an eye towards serving their consumers, which, is not really that bad of a goal to serve your consumers, except, hey, their consumers were also mostly white men of moderate to considerable means, educated in a certain way to believe that the world worked in a certain way. I'm going to say something that's not very nice about me and my fellow professional journalists and the people who came before us. And for the record, that also includes my father and my father's father. I'm already on record of saying this, and you can look it up on the TED website if you'd like to get a fuller view of it. But it comes down to this. A lot of people lament the virtual meteor shower that is exterminating journalism as we have long known it. And you know what? I'm just like, let it rain. Because what is happening is the democratization of our storytelling. And I beg you to show me a democratization process that has ever gone smoothly. It's always messy, and right now, it's really, really messy. The ethics and the morals and community standards and legal frameworks that guide our social media are a big, fat, hot mess. And the one thing that the few remaining pros can offer, in addition to a pretty good framework for how not to tell diverse and intersectional stories, are some tips related to gathering stories in general. So to wrap up today, that's what I wanted to offer to you. If you want to pay forward your privilege the next time you travel, if you're ready to turn off the selfie setting on your phone, if you're interested in helping your fellow Americans see the world as it really is, and not through the lens of fear and loathing that a lot of powerful people would really prefer we see it through, this is my humble advice to you. First and foremost, there are stories that I really don't want you to do. I don't want you to run head-on into war zones and natural disasters and other emergency situations. I mean, first of all, remember, the traditional correspondents are already there. That's their bread and butter. And there are still some folks out there who are doing exemplary work. The work by Jeffrey Gettleman in the New York Times on ethnic cleaning in Myanmar is absolutely top-notch. And quite frankly, it's devastating. So please, let people like Jeffrey do that work. There is no story that's worth your life, so don't do dangerous. Dangerous doesn't just apply to situations where you could be hurt or killed. I don't want you going to jail either. Every nation on earth has different laws about reporting and different ways of enforcing those laws. A good place to start, if you want to make sure you're staying on the same side of things when you're traveling and storytelling, is to refer to the World Press Freedom Index. It turns out that there's a pretty strong correlation between countries with poor press freedoms and countries with oppressive judicial systems and really, really dirty jails. So just keep that in mind. Second, don't try to explain a culture that isn't yours. I have a colleague from Mexico City who's constantly having her country's culture, heritage, history, and politics mansplained to her by students who lived in Mexico for 18 months to 2 years. That's wrong, it's pathetic. Let's celebrate and lift up people's own voices. Let's let them explain their culture. Let's let them explain their heritage and history. Let's let them explain their traditions and their problems and their successes. Quote people liberally. Third, be transparent. If you're gathering information to share with the world, make sure that the people you are talking to understand that. It's really not that hard to say the words, can I ask you some questions for my blog? Or can I take a picture for a photo essay that I'm going to publish on Instagram? And of course, it should go without saying that if someone doesn't want to participate, well, we give them their privacy. Transparency also applies on the publishing side of things. Always seek to tell your audience where your information came from and how you gathered it. Fourth, be humble. There's a tendency on the part of Westerners in general and Americans in particular, I guess, to believe that we have some magic that allows us to figure out what's wrong in the world and find the perfect solution for it. The solution that's been avoiding and eluding everyone else all of this time until we arrived at this place. It's just not true. And solutions don't make for good stories anyway, because good stories are like life. And life is open-ended. We don't know with any sort of certainty what's coming down the road. It is completely okay. In fact, I encourage you to pose a question, to offer some answers, and then to not suggest a neat little fix for everything. And in fact, that's really what we should be aiming for. Fifth, be small. The smaller the question, the better the story. When I was in El Salvador a few months ago, I didn't set out to tell the story of everyone who's trying to get to the United States. I just wanted to know what it was like to be a parent faced with having to decide whether to send your child on a dangerous migration journey in hopes that they'll actually be safer because of it. And when I was in Cambodia a few years ago, I didn't set out to explain the legacy of genocide. I just wanted to know what it's like to be a newly converted Mormon confronted with the prospect of doing family history for the first time. When I was on my second trip to Ethiopia a few years ago, I didn't try to explain the power dynamic of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. I just wanted to know what it was like for people who had been living under the same ruler for 17 years when that man, Meles Zenawi, suddenly disappeared. The overriding rule is honor human decency. That doesn't just mean do unto others as you would have them do unto you, because the idea that what you want or what you would want is what everyone would want is at least egocentric and if not ethnocentric. Seek to treat people the way they want to be treated, and if you're not sure, ask them, they'll tell you. And if there's one overriding strategy I've learned, it's this. The absolute best tools for storytellers are curiosity and compassion. And what I've found is that when you approach people with those two things and no greater agenda, it's absolutely amazing what people will be willing to tell you. And when you share what you've learned with other people, no matter if it's an audience of millions or of strangers or just a few close friends, you're engaging in an act of journalism, you're engaging in an act of diplomacy, and you're engaging in an act of global goodwill. And we really need that right now.